So the anniversary of Bayonetta 3 just passed, so now that all that excitement surrounding this game has died off, I want to start talking about both it and the series as a whole. I haven't played Origins yet, so I can't say anything about that, but I'm very familiar with the 3 mainline games. So if I had to rank all 3 of these games, this is probably how I do it. Bayonetta 1 is number 1. It's a perfect blend of goofy, fun, made for the whole family action. Gameplay, the most important part of the game, is so incredibly fluid that I haven't gotten tired of it after multiple playthroughs. It's so fluid, so fast, so really hard. Even on normal mode, this game does not hold back. I think it's best not to worry about your rank first time around and just try and have fun with what you've got as you slowly get better and better. I had so much fun learning how to play this game that I actually went ahead and platinumed normal mode to unlock Jean, which was a tumultuous experience. But I came out the other side knowing so much more about the intricacies of this game. I had to learn things like dodge offset, which combos to use to rack up points, how to not get hit, that one glitch where you just shoot a bunch of bazookas everywhere. Combat in this game is fun on its own, but the real joy comes from learning and mastering it. It's crazy how much I improved from when I first started this game, and every little flair that this game adds too. Torture attacks, climaxes, you can use enemy weapons or even pull out your own chainsaw sometimes. The Nintendo outfits all have their own quirks. Everything you can do feels so over the top and just fun. And the fights themselves are incredible, especially the bosses. I really wish they brought back Cardinal Sin fights, or at the very least fights just like them. They just feel so intense and grandiose without having to rely on spectacle alone. You don't just fight them, you climb all over them, you chop off their limbs, slice their faces, pop their pimples. It's fantastic, and the final boss fight? Nothing in this series comes close to that. It is a fight not just against a single enemy, but the entire environment. You're trapped within this Dyson sphere where everything around you is constantly changing and trying to kill you, so you have to navigate around it to hit the sphere's center. It's like if the entirety of SMT Nocturne was you just trying to kill Kagetsuchi from the beginning. This game's presentation is masterful. The chapter select screens and animations being a toy on a board accompanied by a track that exudes sorrow, class, and mystique, and even a little bit of fear. There's a certain enclosed feeling I get from this game that only one other title has managed to replicate. Catherine. Part of that might have to do with how prominent a bar is in both games, but I think it also has to do with how both games blend this jazz piano style of music with visuals that feel isolated and lonely. The chapter select screen in this game doesn't feel very welcoming. Like I said before, it's more mysterious than anything. This, combined with the dim brown yet just colorful enough palette of this game's UI, makes even menus feel like a distant memory rather than something tangible and in the moment. Of course, this contrasts highly with the way this game opens. Everything is just thrown at you at once, killing angels, tearing clothing, a bunch of guns, Joe Pesci, but he doesn't actually use the guns like he usually does. Eggman, lollipops. This all continues well into the game too. Even when there's downtime to explain the game's narrative or present something sentimental, you always expect something weird to happen in the next 5 seconds, and usually you're right. The game is loud, goofy, and yet still manages to remain classy at the end of it all. The way that this game manages to balance somber and silly forms of presentation like this is so incredibly well done, and even implies that these two concepts go hand in hand, which they do. Even if the game's narrative isn't anything special, the emotions this game's visuals, music, and gameplay give off are more than enough to win me over. I think I said something in the Mother video about how you can easily distract me from an okay game by sticking something funny in the middle of it, and I think a similar idea really rings true here. The story doesn't have to matter all that much, as long as everything else manages to stick in your head even years down the line. Now, in terms of narrative, there isn't much going on here. Like I said, it's not that great. But I will say, I don't think it's as bad as what I was expecting it to be. Yes, it's messy in so many places, and half the time I forgot how we even got to where we are. The time traveling aspect of this game is never explained and used oddly nonchalantly, as if it were just a normal thing in this world. People pretend to die all the time and then immediately come back, making it feel like there are no stakes in this world. In many ways, the nonsensical nature of this game's story kinda shot later games in the foot, which tried to tell more compelling stories. However, for this game, I feel that the story is perfect. The reason I like it so much is almost the opposite of why I enjoy something like Nocturne's narrative. While Nocturne's underdeveloped characters serve the purpose of getting across the game's overall themes, Bayonetta's underdeveloped story serves the purpose of properly introducing you to its characters. Even if nobody in this game was necessarily complex, depending on how you would define a complex character, they were all likable enough for me to still enjoy their on-screen presence. Rodan, Italian, Yuri Lowenthal, Kid Cereza, even Baldur was funny. Also, another reason I think one story works well for this game in particular is because Bayonetta has amnesia and half the time she doesn't even know where she's going. All in all, the game needed a narrative that did its job in letting its character shine, and I think it accomplished just that. Alright, the music. If you were to just go through the game's OST and listen to everything in order, you'd just probably hear a lot of event tracks and hymns. Of course, that logic could be applied to many games, and I'm not going to judge it that way. Instead, in-game, you're constantly going to hear a few different battle themes, and they're all great. Mysterious Destiny, Riders of the Light, Fly Me to the Moon remix. Even less standouty tracks like the heavies still work really well. It's not like Sonic Unleashed where there's just one track for everything. Here, there's variety. I really don't think describing these themes could do them justice. It's much better to just listen, or even better, experience them in-game. Half the time, you won't even notice the transitions between these songs. They just fit the bombastic nature of this game so well that it blends into the background, in a good way. This game wouldn't have half the charm it has now if it weren't for its music. It's one big spectacle where song and dance are interwoven with punches, kicks, and Iron Maidens. And of course, the credits theme remains one of the best of any game ever. Is this game perfect? No. Graphically, it hasn't aged the most gracefully, and gameplay-wise, some things are just unnecessarily hard or unfair. I don't mind the general difficulty of the game. In fact, I actually kind of like it. It forces the player to not only learn the game's mechanics, but also different weapon combinations and techniques depending on each challenge. Alfheim portals, though, are probably the most annoying part of the game. Just attempting to access them is difficult enough, since some require to backtrack during very specific points within the chapter. If you progress too far, though, you hit the next set of areas within the chapter and can't go back without restarting the entire thing. If you decide to do them while playing the main game, which to be fair you probably won't, they're pace breakers. And if you decide to focus on them after the fact, you'll get a mixed bag of challenges. I think my biggest problem with some of the Alfheim challenges is the time limit. I understand that it's supposed to push you to think on your feet and adapt to the game's fluid combat, but I just don't think a time limit is necessary when you have challenges like limited punches and kicks and don't get hit. I feel like those are challenges enough on their own. I like the idea of these portals offering replayability, but I think later games do a better job of getting their difficulty down pat, as well as being able to access them. A few other small things to mention. I like how the health bars for each affinity they don't have a health bar, they just have armor. And the more that armor breaks, the more you can tell they're closer to dying, and they're easier to stagger once that armor comes off too. I think that's really cool. The enemy variety here is really nice too. I'll get into this a little bit more when I talk about Bayonetta 3, but stuff like Joy and the Car Angel are just funny, and the angels have their own personalities. They're all fun to fight, but they're all just fun to look at too. Oh yeah, and there's a final dance sequence too. That's probably one of my favorite parts of these games. Maybe. No. And Angel Attack. Angel Attack is something that I'm not sure why they never brought it back. I like it. I don't see what's the problem with it. It's not really distracting. It's a mini-game at the end of each chapter, and it's just shooting. And you get some items for it if you do well enough. It's not really anything important, but I like it. I don't know why it's gone. I don't know why it's gone in later games, I mean. I guess to end it on a downer note, here are some other things, minor things that I disliked. Camera can be a bit wonky sometimes. I think 2 does a better job of this. Not 3, but 2 does a better job of its camera. The Space Harrier sequence is annoying and very disorienting. I wish they touched that up a little bit. The Afterburner sequence, the motorcycle sequence, I mean, that one's cool. But the shooting one, nah, I don't really like that one. Playing as Jean also requires you to start a new game. This is something they fixed in later games. But for some reason in this one, if you want to change your character, you have to start a brand new file. And I don't get that. I don't know. Okay, moving on to Bayonetta 2. If Bayonetta 1 is number 1, my favorite, then Bayonetta 2 would be number 3, my least favorite. I'm not sure how controversial this is. I think people like 2. But 2 just does not hit the same highs as its predecessor. Don't get me wrong, it's a really good game that improves quite a bit over the original. It makes graphical improvements, designs newer and more varied weapons, adds new enemies, is more beginner-friendly, but for every step forward it takes, I feel that it takes 2 steps back. Graphically, I have no problem with this game. It looks fantastic, and its color palette is a marked improvement over the first game. Combat-wise though, 2 does not feel nearly as satisfying as 1. Enemies are easier, sure, but they also feel like damage sponges in this game, which is made especially obvious by the Umbran Climax mechanic. You are constantly piling hits on top of big angel and demon enemies, but you're only doing a fraction of the damage you think you should be doing. I don't mind toning the game down a bit, since harder difficulties are a thing in this game, but compensating for it by either jacking up enemy health or decreasing your character's damage output isn't fun in the slightest. Most smaller enemies don't have this problem, and they're actually pretty fun to fight. It's just bosses and mini-bosses that feel like a chore to go against most of the time. Umbran Climax also feels like it exists to slowly phase out torture attacks. They're still here, but most of the time you have to choose between exhausting your magic to do one or the other, and it's way easier to activate Umbran Climax because its prompt isn't as situational as that of a torture attack. The button inputs for these two actions are very different, so there's no confusing them in the heat of battle, but Umbran Climax definitely feels like a step towards what we would get in the third game. Which is a shame because I really like torture attacks. They're funny. On the topic of combat, the weapon selection in this game is a bit too varied, if that makes any sense. I love the idea of getting a bunch of these new weapons that we can try out and experiment with. That was part of the fun of the first game. I just wish that the game remembered that Bayonetta can use guns too. Just like the first game, this one has its own set of pistols in the form of Love is Blue. But there are no shotguns, no bazookas, no other types of weapons even resembling guns besides the handguns, which are in every game. The way guns are used in this series are part of what makes Bayonetta Bayonetta, and I was hoping the devs would add new types of guns in the sequel. But instead they just took everything out. Yeah, I like using whips, scythes, and even a chain chomp, but where are the guns? Where's the beef? I think it's funny for me to mention something like that as a complaint, as my favorite weapon combination in the first game was katana plus ice skates. But I really did enjoy learning how to use things like bazookas as well, and feel as if setting these elements aside takes away from what makes the series iconic. I like these weapons, I do like the new weapons, but I wish there were more gun-like weapons. One more thing to touch on in terms of combat has to do with the final boss, who is nowhere near as great as Jubileus. In the first game, the final boss was your environment, making the entire sequence feel grandiose and so different from everything else in the game. The techniques you've learned leading up to this boss are still useful, but you could tell this game was trying to make you feel powerless by placing you in this strange and unknown locale. Bayonetta 2 does the opposite. It uses its brand new mid-air battle sequences to make you feel powerful, basically boiling down the fight to a culmination of everything you already know. This sounds like a weird thing to complain about, since a final boss being the culmination of everything you've learned seems like a logical progression. The problem is that when I say the culmination of everything, I really mean the culmination of every boss fight you've had with Lopter so far. The boss feels like a souped up version of the last time you fought him, yes, but not like an all-powerful god the way Jubileus felt. Combine that with the fact that, unlike the Jubileus fight, you feel very familiar with the environment you fight Aesir in, gameplay-wise, not visually. He doesn't really leave much of an impact on you. It just feels like fighting any other boss fight. I was hoping 3 wouldn't make the same mistake twice, but we'll get into that. Now, I said earlier that graphically, this game is a great improvement over the first, and that's true. However, this game's presentation feels like it had much less thought put into it. I don't really mind the chapter select menu, it doesn't give me the same feeling as the first game did, but you could attribute that to just Bayonetta not having amnesia. My biggest problem probably has to do with the clock border that appears during those still animated cutscenes in the Gates of Hell. They just look so cheap compared to the film reel animations of the first. And the way they move you from cutscene to cutscene is a little bit disorienting. The Gates of Hell used to feel really cool every time you entered because of that film reel effect. But now it looks cheap and even cuts Rodin's lines off a little too soon from what I remember.
The world-famous Rodin's, where demons and gunsmithing go together like chicken and waffles. Sorry, I'm mad hungry. What can I do you for?
These are small things, but the first game was presented as carefully as possible to evoke a suave, sensual, yet somber feeling in the player. None of that translates to this game. What's more, 2 is nowhere near as silly or memorable as the first game. It may have a much wider color palette, but I remember less about 2's plot and setting than I do 1. Now that could be due to the fact that I've played 1 more than 2, but I feel like I should remember more after about 3 playthroughs of 2. This isn't to say that the over-the-top nature of the series is gone, but everything mildly interesting happened during the first chapter. Sure, the new locales and boss fights are cool, but where's Bayonetta shooting an angel in the wee-wee? Where is her giving you the finger and using it to start up a bike in midair? Where's Baldur making funny jokes? Isn't he supposed to be Lopter anyway? None of this goofiness is present, and the game's narrative does not make up for it at all. It's all just time travel confusion and a focus on Loki, who is not an interesting or likable character in the slightest. I would have preferred if they just used Kid Cereza again or something. What's even worse is that they try to convince you that Bayonetta forms some sort of motherly bond with this kid, and it is just not believable in the slightest. There's no reason for her to like this guy at all, let alone for us. There's way too much downtime in this game, and none of it feels like it has any real purpose. Remember how I said in the first game, after every sentimental moment you could expect something weird to happen in the next 5 seconds? That isn't the case for this game. The only part of the game's plot that I actually liked was Balder's redemption arc, which wraps a really nice bow on the first game while characterizing Bayonetta a bit more. I'm not saying narrative is such an important part of the series, as it's certainly not what I play this series for, but the narrative just stands out so much more when there are no goofy characters or events to distract the player from it. So just a few other things that I liked from this game. You have more customization options, and I mean that in terms of cosmetics, different costumes, and I really like it. I like how many options you have. They bring the Nintendo outfits back. I think they add a new one here, the Star Fox one. And then in general, there's just more outfits, more stuff to buy, more stuff to customize yourself with. The Max Lumen fights are really cool, though. That's probably the best combat part of this game for me. I really like the Mass Lumen fights. I thought they were really cool. It's cool to battle a Mass Lumen for the first time. Sorry, a Lumen Sage for the first time, after hearing about them from the first game. You do fight him. You do fight Balder in that game, in the first game. But it's nice to fight somebody who's on an even playing field instead of somebody who's absorbed a kid into their chest. There are less button mashing segments during cutscenes. There's no quick time events that'll auto kill you like in the first game, which is another thing I didn't like from that game. So all of that's gone, and I think that's really good. However, the button mashing segments during torture attacks or the climaxes, I don't know, they just feel cheaper for some reason. They feel not as satisfying to pull off. Maybe that's because they're easier to pull off, but I don't know. I don't like them that much. The music at the beginning of the game, that's probably my favorite of the Records of Time themes. I think I like it more than the first games, which is Red and Black, I think. Red and Black are one of a kind, one of those two. Multiple playable characters in the same file. That's really good. You can play as Jean or Rosa, and there's like a 2-player mode, which I didn't really do. It's not that good. You can also play as Rodin or Balder, which is cool. I wish you could play them I wish you could play as them in the main game, but it's cool that they're playable at all. Alright, the few things I don't like. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I don't think I mentioned this. Yeah, I don't think I mentioned this, but Lopter is a terrible villain. He's very boring. He's not funny. Like I said before, he's not funny like Balder, which is really weird because technically they're the same character according to this game's story. I wish he was a little more interesting than just a god, a power-hungry god. Which, I mean, you know, Balder wasn't in the first game too, but at least he was funny. And Bayonetta 3. If Bayonetta 1 is number 1, and Bayonetta 2 is number 3, then Bayonetta 3 is number 2. It's slightly better than 2 in my opinion. Slightly. Bayonetta 3 just makes so many missteps that you would think it would be below 2, but it manages to succeed in 2 different areas that I find to be highly important in a Bayonetta game. Combat and presentation, which I've talked about in the previous 2 games. I'm sure many would disagree with me on both of these, but let me explain. Bayonetta 3 does not have weapon customization. Bayonetta 3 de-emphasizes torture attacks even more than 2. Bayonetta 3 has Viola, who's gonna be her own separate category here. Bayonetta 3 has samey, boring-looking villains in the form of homunculi. Bayonetta 3 has a clunky battle system in the form of Demon Slave, which completely contrasts with Bayonetta's fluid movement. Bayonetta 3's camera whacks out probably more than the first game. All of this is true, and I hate all of it. However, even with all of this in mind, 3's combat somehow feels better than 2's. It's still not up to par with 1, of course, but I found myself having way more fun fighting in this game than I did in 2. Well, playing as Bayonetta, at least. I'm not sure if it's the physics, or the new weapons, or the fact that I no longer feel like I was doing chip damage, but something here just clicked for me. If anything, I felt that enemies died way quicker than I expected them to. Even if everything surrounding it felt kinda clunky at best, the core of the Bayonetta series somehow remained intact here. I'm surprised I ended up feeling this way, since I honestly found this game to be the easiest of the 3. Here's my final ranking on my first playthrough. The first 2 games I had at least 1 or 2 stones. and in the first game I had a lot of stones. Despite being easy though, I never felt that I wasn't being challenged. It's possible that the game was challenging and the developers just lowered the requirements for getting a good rank, or maybe all that experience from 1 really paid off. Either way though, I did really like the core combat of this game, when any of those other problems didn't rear their heads. The big new mechanic of this game is Demon Slave, which you can tell was at least partially inspired by Astral Chain. In fact, a lot of things in this game felt like they were taken straight out of Astral Chain. Demon Slave, Demon Masquerade being a fusion between you and your controlled creature, the designs of the new enemies, the fact that they're called homunculi, the more open environments, the story's focus on sci-fi elements, chaos gears, man-made bioweapons, the neon colors this game likes to use, trying to go for a more compelling and heartfelt plot. Even this game's first gameplay trailer tried to fake you out with Lappy. The difference here though is that Astral Chain is an original IP made with all of these design decisions in mind, while Bayonetta is an existing IP that clashes with many of Astral Chain's ideas. Demon Slave sounds cool in theory, but really it's just you controlling a big clunky monster that goes against the idea of Bayonetta's fast and combo-based gameplay.
The audio, I lost the rest of the audio, so I have to re-record this part onward. That's why it sounds weird. It's not like Astral Chain's system where controlling a separate character is part of getting the full experience. It was rare that I actually liked controlling demon slaves, and as soon as I got that accessory that allows the game to control it for you, I just left that on for the rest of the game. This would actually hurt me during the witch trials though, as one of the homunculi you have to fight requires you to use some sort of ranged or sonar move from Mictlantecutli. I think it was an attack actually, not a sonar move. The AI never ended up doing this, and I wasn't allowed to unequip my accessory. I'm pretty sure you can't unequip it. I tried, so I couldn't progress. It was a good run too, way better than my second. Side note about the witch trials. Trial 3 is a huge jump in difficulty in the sense that one hit knocks off about 1/3 of your health. This is because the game automatically jumps to non-stop infinite climax mode for this trial, apparently, as there's one trial for each difficulty starting with normal. So normal, hard, and non-stop infinite, and then the other one, the hard one, the really hard one. I really don't like the idea of just decreasing or increasing new stats and just calling that a hard mode. I'd much rather they would just have faster, smarter, and different enemy formations. Anyway, I've gotten off track. Demon Slave isn't just clunky, but also fills up the entire screen with so much stuff that it can get really hard to see anything at times, let alone your own character. Sometimes too much action on screen can lead to you not experiencing any action at all. The best parts about Demon Slave are A, the dance that you have to do to summon them, and B, their functionality as combo finishers, which make for deeply satisfying combos. That's actually another parallel this game has with Astral Chain. Both have flashes of light that appear when you can pull off a combo finisher. In Astral Chain, this basically means summoning your legion for a final blow, which is again very similar to how this game and its Demon Slave finishers work. This is actually something that confused me at first with this game, because this game has two different types of flashes. One of them is the purple flash that functions like the blue flash from Astral Chain, and the other is a flash that indicates an enemy is about to attack you. I essentially had to get used to dodging instead of attacking when I saw that flash early on. Demon Masquerade is probably the least egregious addition to this game. It's very silly, sometimes a little too silly even for this series. Some of these transformations are kinda cool looking and offer some unique approaches to gameplay. I particularly like the Kraken and Spider transformations because they feel so inhuman to control. Some of these though look like something straight out of Balan Wonderworld. I think with how much more expansive movement is in this game, it makes sense to give you the option to swing around, glide, or create mid-air platforms. And these transformations can also occur mid-combo too, making for some neat, if not goofy, visuals. But aesthetically, I'm kind of mixed on this mechanic. Plus, if I had to choose between Demon Masquerade and weapon customization, I'd more than happily choose the latter. Being able to have one set of weapons on your hands and another on your feet was one of the coolest parts of the previous games. It gave you so many different weapon combos to try and encouraged you to experiment to figure out the combos you liked or which ones were best for that particular situation. Bayonetta 3 completely cans this mechanic, giving you only one weapon set at a time. No sword in your hand with bazookas on your feet, no holding a hammer with a chain chomp strapped to your leg. With each weapon being based around a demon transformation this time around, there was no room for customization, which is something that only hurts this game. It's especially frustrating when the weapon selection is so good this time around. Yo-yo rollerblades, a train that doubles as a chainsaw, a mic stand, a magic hat, and a wand. Since every weapon has to be able to shoot its own thing, we did get, albeit a small amount, of new gun type weapons like Tartarus and G-Pillar. They are really cool weapons in their own right, but you can tell that potential was wasted when you realize kick attacks for weapons like the train saw and G-pillar are just another form of swinging them around. I just really wish I could experiment with mixing and matching these things. Each weapon, apart from Scarborough Fair, Love is Blue, and I think the handguns, also has its own special move that I think you need to push down on both sticks to activate. I would always forget to use this, though that's more of a me problem, but these moves really aren't necessary, especially if you can rely on your own skills. I talked earlier about how 3D emphasizes torture attacks, but considering I probably use them more in this game than 2, I don't think I'm quite being fair on this game by accusing it of that. What I mean by a de-emphasis is that this game doesn't really focus in on those attacks, be it visually or mechanically. Both the first and second game require you to go out of your way and activate a torture attack once your magic meter had a full bar. And when you would activate it, the camera focused in on the attack as you mashed whatever button you were told to. In this game, you still have to activate it manually, but it only happens when an enemy is either knocked down or dizzy. I'm still not exactly sure how that mechanic works. I probably skipped through a tutorial too fast somewhere early on. Furthermore, once you do activate it, there's no button mashing prompt, and the animation takes about 2 to 5 seconds to kill the enemy. If that. I think I'm being generous with that. The previous games made torture attacks feel like something special, and although I know not everyone might like them, those button mashing segments made the player feel like they themselves were the ones actively controlling each torture device. The vice and chainsaw from the first game immediately come to mind. It's like you're the one turning the wheel or sawing through flesh. This applies less so to the second game, since I felt that its button prompts weren't nearly as satisfying to pull off. They were easier, sure, but something about the visual feedback from the UI and the physical feedback from the controller's rumble made these prompts feel like a cheap knockoff of the first games. Bayonetta 3 completely does away with these prompts in the field of torture attacks, and just make them feel so unimportant, as there's no real fanfare to them. A quick animation just plays for a few seconds and that's it. Where's the spectacle? I understand that to some people these attacks might have just been pace breakers that were better off gone, since they were more so helpful for beginners given their measly point outputs. But I thought they all brought a certain charm to the game that I dearly miss. I mean, what other game allows you to pull off something like this? Plus, because of Demon Slave, you don't really get as much of a chance to activate them even if they are here. Though like I said, I activated them more than I did in 2. With how integral combat is to the identity of Bayonetta, would you be surprised if I told you that there were other things that you could do in this game? Things like walking to the next combat area. Bayonetta 3 tries to expand upon the exploration aspect of these games, creating more open-ended environments hidden with secrets and puzzles. In theory, this could either give greater depth to the game's gameplay loop by creating a richer and more enthralling environment, or it could just lead to unnecessary bloat. In practice, it kinda leads to both. This isn't an open-world game at all. It uses a similar structure to previous games, but just doubles the walking space of each area, basically. It almost feels like this game is trying to have its cake and eat it too, but it kinda works for me sometimes. It's hard to really pinpoint how I feel about this game's exploration, but here's what I'll say. I feel like there are many benefits to an open-ended approach to Bayonetta, as long as the developers understand how to utilize it. I much prefer how this game hides portals throughout its world over something like the first game, for example. The Alfheims sometimes forced you to backtrack or go to specific places at specific points throughout each level, while this game's, what are they called? Gab portals, something like that. Whatever they're called, they never require backtracking and are placed in areas where the player would naturally find them once it is understood how exploration works in this game. The Umbran Tears of Blood in this game are mini challenges that force the player to learn ways to approach movement and mobility, apart from the frog. I much prefer both the structure and collection process of Umbran Tears in this game over that of the last 2 games. Both of these types of challenges highly benefit from a bigger environment. But then there are things like puzzles or these flowers that give you money that just feel like busy work. Part of me wonders if I would get tired of just fighting things over and over if segments like these didn't exist, making this a sort of white rice and meat situation. But I know that can't be true. You don't have to bloat a game to make someone appreciate it, and clearly there are more fun things you can do with a more open format. I think part of my boredom with some of these sections also stems from the game's aesthetics. Aside from the Paris level, I feel like most level themes wore out their welcome, yet simultaneously were never really utilized to their full potential. With better visuals and ironed out gameplay, I think you could maybe do something interesting with a more open design philosophy. With that being said, there's something to be said here about replayability. In previous games, it's pretty easy to jump into any chapter and play through them in one sitting. But because of how open some of its chapters are, 3 isn't nearly as easy to hop into on a whim. Again, some of this game just feels like unnecessary bloat. I think I just want to end off gameplay talk by reiterating that despite all my ramblings, this game's combat is still a ton of fun and in my opinion, an improvement over that of the second game. The way the core movement and combat of this game feels is so precise and nimble that it really does feel like you're performing a dance with each combo. I popped back into this game's training mode to give myself a refresher for this video, and I somehow got sucked in for a solid 30 minutes or so just figuring out each weapon's combos again. At its core, without all that baggage that comes with it, Bayonetta 3 is an excellent action game. The only thing that I think is wrong with this game's core gameplay is that there are now layers to perfect dodging. You activate Witch Time if you perfect dodge, but it only lasts a reasonable amount of time if you perfect dodge, which is basically just the perfect dodge from the first two games. Essentially, there are now two different windows to activate Witch Time. The first one's easier but gives you less, second one's harder but gives you more time. I don't see a reason for this. I'd prefer it if there was just one perfect dodge timing and your Witch Time would be consistent throughout the game, like the first two games. At least I'm assuming. If there was something like this in the first two games, I never noticed it. It's annoying, but every aspect of gameplay remains pretty much intact. Wait, there's actually one more gameplay related thing that I have to talk about. The Jeanne levels. In this game, Jeanne has either 3 or 4 levels dedicated to what she's doing in context of the story. But instead of playing as a 3D hack and slash, these levels are more Metroidvania-esque. I honestly like these levels. They're nothing fantastic, but I enjoyed them for what they were. I do like the intro sequence, but I wish you could skip it after the first time. I don't think you can. With that being said, most people probably won't like how much of a change in pace these levels are, and even I think they would have been better off retooled or cut entirely. Instead of a complete change in genre, I feel like it would make more sense to keep the concept of Jeanne not being able to use Wicked Weaves or summons, but leave the game as a hack and slash. Make these chapters mini boss rushes or just smaller, more linear levels that require the player to learn how to use weapons and combos. Something like this might have been a good way to keep Jeanne feeling unique while allowing her sequences to still feel like something normal in a Bayonetta game. This could have also taught players to rely less on their summons and actually learn how to play the game. Plus, you wouldn't have to dedicate too many resources to these levels if you just keep them small. I don't know, that's just an idea, but even if I like the Jeanne levels, they absolutely feel out of place. Okay, presentation. This game's UI is a massive improvement over 2. It has its own identity from 1 without feeling like a cheap knockoff. Everything from the game's HUD to the Gates of Hell's UI, to even the ranking screens after each fight look fantastic. And they feel good to navigate too. It's really hard to explain, but like the first game's torture attacks, there's a certain level of both heft and smoothness that needs to be felt when your inputs are given feedback. Kinda like how certain electronics need to feel heavy to hold in order to not seem like a knockoff product. I think this game nails that and looks almost as good as the first, but I did find those wheels in the menus weird to navigate this time around. Not hard, but they just take some getting used to. However, when I say presentation, I don't just mean UI. I'm talking general silliness and style. This game feels like a return to form based on how cool and goofy it is. It's like some of that first game's soul was finally integrated back into the series. The opening sequence of the first chapter, not the prologue, or not the Records of Time, the one with, what's his name? Rodin in the pizza penguin outfit, is about as goofy as ever. Every game so far has had an incredible intro. But then you have things like accessing the Gates of Hell. It's not a portal anymore, now you have to place an LP on a turntable and it just shows up right in front of you wherever you are, wherever the turntable is. There are different variations of the Gates of Hell music too, and while none of them are as good as the original, they are all a really nice listen. And the way that each chapter ends with a deadly sin ritual, each of which is unique from the last, I think they're all references to some other property or story too. Godzilla, Journey to the West, The Fifth Element, and I guess Devil May Cry? I'm not sure about that last one. I like almost all of these. The Gamora one, not so much. It was just kind of boring and slow. You just respond accordingly to whatever the other guy does, and they make you do it again in the final boss. But the rest of them are just these loud, fun little sequences that add a bit more to the game's personality. It's just such a breath of fresh air to see stuff like this after 2. I get that some people might want chapters to end with a battle instead of a minigame, but you do technically get a major battle right before each deadly sin ritual. These sequences feel more like an added bonus than a replacement. With that being said, I would like to see the bombastic nature of these rituals intertwined with something like the Cardinal Virtue boss fights from the first game. I will always go back to those fights because they are some of the best in the entire series, and it's sad to see that even this game's bosses don't come close to what Bayonetta 1 was able to pull off. If you could mix the presentations of both 1 and 3 in regards to major boss fights, the end result may be a big spectacle made out of not only what you're seeing, but also what you're doing. I don't know, I think it would be cool. I do want to specifically touch on the presentation of the Paris series of levels. The Paris area in this game was my favorite due to its tight pacing, visual aesthetics, and most importantly, ridiculousness. I don't know if this area has the shortest set of levels in the game, but it absolutely feels that way considering how much memorable stuff you do in the span of a single chapter. Plus, out of every other universe in this game, this is the one to take itself the least seriously. The area's backstory is just Bayonetta running from French Enzo, spelled this way. There are at least 2 random dance sequences. There's a big spectacle of a shooter level that's not as fun as 1's motorcycle section, but is more fun than its space harrier section. And then the shooting section ends with you fighting a big clock. That's not even mentioning the deadly sin ritual of this chapter, which is the best one in the entire game. It's clear that the developers understood that this area takes place in France and should thus be just one big carnival ride. And I think that's the best way to approach Bayonetta. I also think it helps that this is the most visually interesting level, since every fight or even area to explore feels like a set piece with actual purpose. Viola's fight with Luca, the shooting sequence and its boss, the areas where you fight Beta 4, Bayonetta, and Rosa, the Gamora sequence, and even the Deadly Sin ritual, I constantly felt visually engaged, as even when there was downtime, you would still be doing stuff like going through underground tunnels. This variety is something I think was missing from pretty much every universe so far, aside from maybe the Japanese one. It's also really funny how silly this area is, considering it contains what is possibly the most emotional part of the game, the part where you shoot your mom. Bayonetta has seen her mom die right in front of her in every game so far, but this time she's the one who has to kill her. It's a really effective use of the multiverse concept, and probably the only time I actually felt something other than anger or indifference when it comes to this game's story. You don't have to fill a Bayonetta game with dancing for it to feel ridiculous. In fact, I'd much rather that you'd keep these moments sparing so that they feel special, even if the Bayonetta series does rely on, dancing. But what I'm trying to say is to have cutscenes and moments that stand out to the player and keep them engaged. Because remember, this game series is first and foremost supposed to be dumb fun. Aside from the mouth animations, this game is animated very well. The Color My World attack animations look really smooth and are purposefully reminiscent of a dance. Every other weapon set and their respective demon masquerades have their own sets of animations, all of which both look and feel really nice, whether it be during combat or otherwise. These same compliments, however, cannot be given to this game's visuals. For some reason, this game is a visual downgrade from 2 and even 1 sometimes. Just look at the eyes. There's something off about Bayonetta's eyes in this game. I'm assuming the downgrade comes from how big this game is in comparison to the previous 2, and to be fair, it isn't really detracting from anything if you're just here for the gameplay, but it's noticeable enough for me to wonder what exactly happened here. Now, if we're talking about the aesthetic of level themes, and I don't know. I'll get into it more when I talk about the story, but this game revolves around you traveling to different parallel universes. This seems like a good way to give the game a bit of variety and make its areas stand out from the rest of the series. The problem is that you feel less like you're traveling to different universes and more like you're taking a plane ticket to Tokyo or Paris. This game doesn't feel like a multi-dimensional crisis, it feels like a world tour, which just makes you wonder why the game felt the need to have a multiverse plot in the first place. The only areas that actually feel like they take place in some alternate universe are the China and Alphaverse levels, of which the latter only hosts a few boss fights. Like I said before, many of these areas wear out their welcome fairly quickly because of how open this game is. I should stress that I do like the variety that this game introduces, as it's much better than 1's constant trips to Paradiso, and different from the more ethereal realms you travel to in 2. It's just how this game presents that variety that disappoints me. Speaking of disappointment, this game's enemies are the homunculi, and they are so incredibly boring. It's possible and highly likely that the chimeras and homunculi from Astral Chain inspired Bayonetta 3's homunculi. But whereas the former's enemy designs actually had a fair amount of variety in both color and visual aesthetic, which is I guess the same thing, the latter's does not. Every stratus or cumulonimbus or nimbostratus or whatever other cloud classifications there are is a faceless, soulless cyan mess of a design that looks complicated for the sake of being complicated. The angels in the first all clearly belonged to a hierarchy and looked and acted differently depending on their capabilities and where they were placed in the hierarchy. There was one that was just straight up a car. Homunculi don't really look too dissimilar to one another aside from their general shape. Half the time I couldn't tell if I was fighting a Flockus or a... I can't even remember their names. And when it comes to personality, that's where the angels especially shine, at least in the first game. They acted like actual people or creatures with awareness of their current situation. They would make these weird noises when attacking or getting angry. The big ones would try and scratch their back to grab you if you were behind them. There was that one big dance-off sequence with Joy, the big guy who fell in love with Cereza, that cutscene at the end of the Temperantia boss fight where either a Fairness or a Fearless is relieved that he didn't die from getting crushed before getting crushed anyways. The Cardinal Virtue boss fights themselves involve angels not only talking but expressing emotions like confusion and fear. There was so much care put into making the enemies feel less like fodder and more like individual creatures with desires and emotions in this first game, which is part of why its silly moments work so well. The angels have perfect comedic timing with Bayonetta because of the way they act as individuals. Torture attacks also helped with this, since you would see so many angels struggle to get out of their torture device before ultimately getting killed anyway. Bayonetta 2... I don't remember much of Bayonetta 2's demons, although I think there was a demon that had some sort of shotgun weapon, which was funny. At least with that game though, enemy demons at the very least had unique and sometimes really funky designs. They were clearly meant to be less funny and more feral. When it comes to the homunculi though, the only semblance of personality I ever got from them was from that one dance sequence in Paris. And that wasn't even performed by homunculi, it was by Prelucidus possessed human soldiers. For all I know, that was less a homunculi thing and more an impulse inherent to French people. What's worse about this game is that, unlike 2, which tried to balance out the amount of demon and angel fights you had, you will almost exclusively be fighting homunculi in this game. There are angel and demon fights in 3, but they are reserved for only a few portals scattered throughout the game's chapters and the witch trials. Otherwise, everything's homunculi with the exception of the occasional wolfman. I truly hope that whatever enemy types are next for this series are better designed and characterized than what we got here. Okay, so now that I explained the good parts of the game, let's get into the bad. Yeah, the story is not so good. I'm not the type of person to play a Bayonetta game for its story, which is to say I'm the average person. No Bayonetta story so far has even been remotely good or sensible. Even one story which I praised is just a convoluted mess of plot points, time travel, and lore that's heavily carried by its character interactions, and the excuse that Bayonetta has amnesia. Furthermore, once it was revealed that 3 was going to have a multiverse-based plot, it was pretty obvious that nothing in this game was going to make sense. I came into this with zero expectations and I pretty much got what I expected. It's still bad though. This game shoves its story in your face, more so than the first 2 I feel, and yet it somehow manages to have the least developed plot of any game in the series. It isn't really convoluted, in fact it's pretty straightforward to understand, but everything is kept so vague or simple that nothing really amounts to anything. Like I said before, what is the point of having a multiverse plotline if every world you go to doesn't look all too dissimilar from your own? I know Bayonetta technically doesn't live on our Earth, since her world has at least a few different countries from her own, but are you really telling me that there is no Tokyo or Paris equivalent in whatever world she lives in? What's more, since the Bayonetta series has always been a more gameplay-driven game over story or character, these multiverses are not developed in any interesting ways that set them apart from the existing universe. There are no individual narratives within these other worlds that develop these characters to a point that I care about them. There are individual narratives, but they're just not that good or interesting. Even when characters like Beta 3 or 4 Bayonetta actually get some kind of character development, we as the players are not present within these worlds long enough for that development to hold any meaning. And it doesn't even matter in the end anyway, because these multiverse characters just end up dying, save for their infernal demons, which aren't really characters. Speaking of which, the demons speak English now, and I don't like that. I don't like that they speak your language. I liked it before, when they spoke demon language. Use this opportunity you have to explore new environments within the existing world you've made, not to set up these brand new worlds in the most basic of ways. Instead of creating multiverses with unique cities and civilizations, explore existing civilizations within the Bayonetta universe that we just haven't seen yet. Instead of introducing alternate versions of Bayonetta, Jean, or other pre-existing characters, create new characters that are not only compelling, but also mesh well with the rest of the cast. Alternatively, don't introduce any new characters aside from your villain, and just try and expand on your pre-existing characters in a way that your audience will find satisfactory. I know it's ridiculous for me to give this kind of advice to a Bayonetta game of all things, but if Devil May Cry 5 is able to get me to care about its characters when I haven't even played any other game in the series, why can't this game? If Bayonetta 1 did a fantastic job of getting me to like this cast that was, at the time, entirely new to me, why can't this game? And of course, there is an overarching narrative. You're not just going to multiverses for fun. Although that could be a good plot, I don't know. You see, this artificial human guy wants to eradicate every single multiverse to merge it all into one. Why? I don't really know. How? He's just powerful, I guess. It's not really explained why he's powerful enough to invade parallel universes, aside from maybe in the lore tablets. Though knowing how time travel works in this universe, it probably isn't hard to do anyway. There's so much here left up to interpretation that there is honestly no reason to care. And yet, especially with the way this game ends, it's clear that this game wants you to care. I'm not gonna get into every plot point in this game because trying to understand it would be a waste of time. But I do have a few questions. What exactly do the terms Arc Eve and Arc Adam entail? What is the point of Dark Adam and Eve? Why give Luca supernatural abilities when part of his character was how good he was at getting through highly dangerous situations for a regular human? Why sideline Luca this entire game instead of giving him more time to develop his relationship with Bayonetta? Why introduce Lucaon and this entire side idea about a kingdom of fairies when it is going to go absolutely nowhere? For the spin-off? Were all of the universes reset at the end of the game? If so, why did Viola stay in a different universe from her own, if that is the implication? And with all that out of the way, here is how I feel about the controversial ending of Bayonetta 3. It doesn't matter. If we're talking about the fact that Bayonetta was killed off, this series has quote-unquote killed off so many characters only to immediately bring them back to life that I honestly don't see what the big deal here is. If they want to bring back Bayonetta in the next game, which they probably do, they'll just find some excuse to bring her back. Every character in the first game died around 5 times each, and they were all fine by the end. Jean turned out alright in the second game, with the game just completely switching to an entirely different plot halfway through. Bayonetta's die left and right in this game, and yet none of that even matters in the end. I don't even know if the alternate Bayonettas get revived at the end of the game, but it doesn't matter to us as the player anyway. I personally don't really care about that ending because it just doesn't really matter to me. There's also that whole thing with Luca and Bayonetta getting together even though their relationship is rarely explored. It's something that's been implied since the first game and they've only now tried to do anything with it. The only real problem is that, like I said, this game does nothing to explore that relationship and then tries to act as if its ending is a big important thing. The first game doesn't try to take its ending seriously, and the second has a reason to get emotional given that it ties back to the first game. This one gives you a big emotional send-off that doesn't feel warranted, and for some reason Luca decides to die alongside Bayonetta despite having a daughter to take care of, despite that not really being his daughter because she's from another dimension. This game leaves you with a lot of questions. None of this is well done in any way, as Bayonetta stories have never been, but the first game at least showed that you can make a fun bad story out of the series instead of a bad story. It is funny to say I don't really care about the ending and then go into that big tangent. No, it's, like I said, I wish it was more fun. I wish the ending was, I wish the story was more fun even if it's bad. And finally, Viola. It seems odd that I'm going to complain a bit about Viola given my indifference to this game's ending, but as long as they improve upon her in whatever comes next, then I still see no reason to feel anything towards that ending. In this game, however, Viola is perhaps the most pointless addition to anything in this entire series. She is pointless within the game's story, she is pointless as a character, she is pointless as a playable character, she serves no purpose whatsoever, and can only be considered slightly better than Loki because of her funny demon cat. In terms of story, from what I noticed, Viola has 3 main purposes: explain why this multiversal invasion is happening, follow Luca, and carry on the legacy of Bayonetta. However, her existence is only really necessary for that last purpose. It's stated in the game that only the world of chaos, which means the human world, is split into different dimensions. Paradiso and Inferno are singular realities that are simply aware of the split in human realities. If we really require context for the ongoing conflict, why not just let Rodin do it? He half does it already. He's a fallen angel who is clearly aware of what this conflict entails, and even if he doesn't know the details, he can still tell us basically what's going on. And I think it's implied by the game that he interacts and deals with every Bayonetta variation across dimensions, so he's absolutely in the know about what's going on in separate dimensions. We don't need Viola when there's already a nigh omniscient being that can do it for us. And when it comes to the second purpose, Viola following Luca, that doesn't lead to anything. The same outcome would have happened if we just let Luca do what he wanted. Before I get to that last story-based purpose, let me explain her purposelessness elsewhere. As a character, Viola is very boring. She has a personality, sure, but it's a very basic one that does not mesh well with any other established characters. And when your game series relies on entertaining characters to carry its poorly constructed stories, it's a pretty big problem to have someone who's not entertaining. I suppose she's supposed to have the quirkiness of her father while also being this nerdy, insecure teen, but it all just comes off as forced and unlikable. It's like they needed someone to fulfill the quota of an inexperienced teen character and went with the most basic idea they could think of. Viola's only interesting quality is her desire to live up to the namesake of her mother. But because that's handled in a single boss fight at the end of the game, despite having the entire game to go through an arc, it's a quality that feels highly manufactured as well. If she's neither entertaining nor interesting as a character, then what purpose does she serve in a game like this? And then when it comes to her gameplay, it's about as basic as her personality. Imagine the katana from the first game, except remember that you have no leg weapon sets in this game, you have no alternative weapons, your ranged gun attacks have been replaced with much slower darts, your dodge is essentially useless, and you have to adapt to a parry mechanic that is highly unintuitive and separate from an already existing parry mechanic in the game that comes with an accessory. Her moveset is somehow both too similar and too different from Bayonetta's to be worth being in this game. What I mean by this is that attack inputs work in pretty much the exact same way as Bayonetta, with the exception of Viola's parry mechanic, which is mapped to either L or R, one of the two. Because Viola controls so similarly to Bayonetta, you will automatically want to use the same tactics as you would with Bayonetta while playing as her. But because Viola's dodge does not give her witch time and she is instead reliant on her parry, which is again a different input from the already established parry mechanic throughout the series, you will constantly find yourself struggling to remember that you're supposed to parry instead of dodge. In something like Devil May Cry 5, which had 3 separate characters, each character had a completely unique playstyle from one another, which made it so that you as the player would automatically know to completely adjust how you play the game based on the character you're playing as. Viola's playstyle isn't different enough to warrant such a major remapping of your brain whenever you switch to her, which is what makes such a slight but major change in how she plays so annoying. If she had a completely different playstyle from Bayonetta, then at least her existence as a playable character would be warranted. But the only thing unique about her is such a minute yet annoying change that I wonder why they even wanted to include her from a mechanical standpoint. What's worse is how little she actually shows up throughout the game, making it so that you don't want to play as her, and when you do get to her chapters, you never really have a chance nor the desire to properly learn her. She doesn't even play a role in the final boss fight against Singularity. Oh yeah, Singularity. He's very boring. More boring than Lopter. Please bring back fun villains like Baldur. Anyway, back to Viola. She instead gets her own fight after that final boss against Dark Eve, who appears out of nowhere but is apparently supposed to be the reason Kraken appeared in Chapter 1, even though the player has likely completely forgotten about that at this point. And even if they hadn't, there is nothing else alluding to her throughout the whole game. Yeah, this game, like I said, leaves you with a lot of unanswered questions, but back to Viola. That fight against Dark Eve is supposed to signify her coming of age and adopting the Bayonetta name. Had we as the player been able to learn how to properly play as her and enjoy her playstyle, this moment would have felt very satisfying for us. However, like I said before, we get no time or reason to learn how to play as her. And this boss fight pretty much showcases exactly how inexperienced we are with her, which completely goes against the idea that she's ready to follow in her mother's footsteps. It's like the inverse of gameplay through storytelling, I think ludonarrative dissonance? So with all of that in mind, let's go back to the idea that Viola is supposed to carry on the legacy of Bayonetta. Viola does nothing of note within the game's story. She is not charismatic enough to serve as a replacement for either Bayonetta or Luca. She experiences a forced form of development that isn't believable in the slightest. She isn't unique in terms of playstyle, nor is she fun to play as. We as the player are rarely able to play as her. We are not able to relate to her struggle or development through gameplay when we do get to play as her. And to top it all off, her design is terrible. She looks like a clown. Again, I like this game. I really do. But man, does it seem like for every step forward, there's a step back. For every push, there's a pull. For every Cheeto, there's a Frito. There is one last thing I want to talk about, and that is this game's music. I believe that this game's overall OST is the best of the series. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. I think that there are plenty of individual tracks from previous games, especially the first, that are better than individual tracks from this game. I still think Fly Me to the Moon and Mysterious Destiny triumph over all other main themes throughout the series. And I believe that, although good in their own right, this game's mixes of tracks like The Gates of Hell and One's credits theme are not quite as good as their respective originals. Even so, as a complete package, I think I remembered and enjoyed more of this game's soundtrack than any other game in the series. Specifically, I remembered more event and cutscene tracks than ever before, especially anything that's big band jazz-esque, like the song that plays before your fight with Beta 4 Bayonetta. I really like the big band jazz aesthetic that this game's soundtrack goes for, and I kinda wish it was used even more throughout. This game also has some tracks that sound a lot like Astral Chain tracks, mainly anything related to homunculi or singularity, such as one of the final boss cutscene intro themes. I I'd like to talk about Astral Chain sometime in the future, as I have a bit to say about that game as well. Ghost, which is Viola's battle theme, is something I'm a little bit more mixed on. I like the song for what it is, but I can't help but feel a little uneasy about the introduction of rock or metal into this series when it has always been poppy and jazzy. It's what sets it apart. This game isn't Devil May Cry, and while there's a lot to learn from that series, it shouldn't try to completely emulate it either. Even if it is indicative of Viola's personality, I feel that that kind of personality shouldn't play such a major role in this series to begin with. I would much prefer to keep the tone of this series' soundtrack consistent than introduce something new that makes it feel a little more generic. Every other original vocal track in this game is great though, even We Are As One, which I didn't think I would like when I first heard it in the trailers. Okay, so let me just think of any other things that I didn't mention, things I liked. Oh, the still animated cutscenes. I don't even know if I'm using that term right. But in the first game they had a film reel aesthetic. In the second game, they had a clock aesthetic, and in this game, they are minimized. They are used, but only for flashbacks of things that happened in different multiverses, so basically to give you a summary of what the story of each multiverse is like as you enter them. And the aesthetic that they use here is the Chaos Gears, and it looks very quality. It looks more quality than either of the previous games, and I like it. Oh, and they bring back the dance sequence at the end. They do that. Good. Anything I didn't like? I mentioned that the demons speak English. I don't like that. Make them speak demon language. English, or whatever language you're playing in, sounds very weird. Less customization options. So, I mentioned that you couldn't customize weapons as much in this game, but that also applies to cosmetics. In this game, costumes consist, I think, entirely of variations of Bayonetta. The variations of Bayonetta you meet. So stuff like the cop costume from the second game, the kimono from the first game, the Nintendo costumes are completely gone. I don't know why. I really like those costumes. It's just I don't know why they decreased the amount of customization this game had. I guess I understand that with this new approach, you want to place all your efforts into the right place, but it is a shame. I wish there was more customization. And this game, it goes for a more sci-fi theme, which I think is very weird. The previous games focused on angels and demons and, mythology. And I'm not saying that they had religious undertones or, important undertones the way that, Shin Megami Tensei does. But, I think it's really weird to go for something more sci-fi, something less ethereal and more human. Because these things, homunculi, are bioweapons, apparently, made by humans. I don't know. Keep that for Astral Chain. I don't think this game series needs it. And I think that's it. Yeah. That's that. Bayonetta 1 is still the best, Bayonetta 3 is more divisive yet more interesting than 2, and Bayonetta 2 is probably the most boring one. I would like to reiterate once again that I think all of these games are great regardless of their flaws. It's just that some of them are more flawed than others, and I think those flaws should be addressed. Hopefully whatever's next improves upon where its predecessors failed. This series is great though. It's a lot of fun, it's very ridiculous, I love what it does, and I look forward to playing Devil May Cry 2